Thank you for joining me today. My name's Nathan Garner. I'm the Technical Pre-Sales and Project Manager here at Dynamic CCTV. And today we're going to be doing a slightly different webinar than we've done in the past. So this is more of a kind of general overview of everything related to CCTV. And so this is the Things You Wish You Knew webinar. So we're going to be taking a look at how you select different cameras, so your lens sizes, when to use thermal cameras, for example, or AccuSense, that kind of thing. We're also going to take a look at some of the units live on our demos. I'm going to cover a bit on the different tools that we have, such as the SADP tool and a couple of the others as well, which we'll be taking a look at. In the Q&A section for this webinar, as we go through, if there's anything that you'd like me to specifically cover during the webinar, if you put it in the Q&A section, and I'll try and cover those as we go through as well. And any questions that you have, if you put them in the Q&A section as well, or you can email myself and the rest of the team on those details on screen as well for this. So the first part of it is just going to be general CCTV as an overview, and then we're going to go more into the IP side of things, and we'll also take a look at the TVI side of it as well in this. So there are a lot of different cameras that are available. So you've got your standard optical cameras, which are your general image cameras, and then we've got thermal. So these work off heat detection. So these are generally used for your longer distance perimeter protection solutions. Can also be used for temperature measurement. So if you have a factory or machines and you need to be able to measure the temperature of the machine and get an alert when it exceeds a specific temperature that you've defined in the configuration, those are where the thermal cameras would come in. You can also use them in a fire detection mode as well. So you can actually have an alert sent through when a fire is detected by the cameras. So they're to be better for your longer distance kind of perimeter protection, and also for your temperature measurement and your fire detection solutions. You then also have fisheye camera lenses. So these are best used as kind of a ceiling mounted camera in the center of a room, and it would give you an overview of the entire room using the 360-degree lens, which we're going to take a look at in a little bit more depth. But they're generally used in kind of shops, in supermarkets, because you can actually track using the heat mapping function of the higher trafficked areas and the directional changes, which direction people are traveling in most frequently. And so they're perfect for kind of shopping scenarios where you want to see exactly where the traffic is within a shopping environment within those. We then also have PEZs. So PEZ stands for pan, tilt and zoom. So generally you'd see these on the corner of buildings, or where you need to look at longer distances and be able to pan around an area. So you can use it as a full area monitoring camera rather than being in a fixed location looking at a fixed point. PEZ, you can move, you can zoom them in, and you can tilt them up and down as well. See a lot of these used in car parks and open environments as well, where you're needing to be able to monitor a wide area. And with a PEZ, some of them you can actually see a lot further than standard, and there's also a thermal range of PEZs where you can see objects over 1.5 kilometers away and see if there's a human or a vehicle. So those are great on the really long distance perimeter coverage. We do see a lot of sites where they'll use multiple cameras in conjunction. So for example, you could have thermal cameras monitoring your perimeter fence. So if anyone crosses that fence line, you can then have that trigger PEZs on site, so you can actually see that person. So the PEZs would spin round to that location where the actual line crossing or intrusion detection on thermal camera has been triggered, so you can get that actual overall image view of that alarm being triggered on the system as well. Our fixed lens cameras, you've got 3 main types, or should I say styles of cameras, and those are the bullet, turrets and the domes. Predominantly we now see the turrets and bullet cameras that are installed outside. These have separate IRs that aren't covered by a dome lid. Generally what you'll see with a dome camera is if it's mounted outside, muck will stick to the actual dome lid, and that can have an effect on the actual image that you're seeing, and also can reflect the IR LEDs as well, so it can reduce the overall quality, especially at night. So we do now recommend and see a lot more bullets and turrets being installed outside as well. That being said, with dome cameras, a lot of them are IK rated, so they are vandal resistant. So when there is a need to install vandal resistant cameras, the domes are more protected and they're prevented a lot more from someone tampering with where the camera's looking or anything like that with those as well. You've then got specialist cameras, so you've got facial recognition. So there's, similar to how an ANPR camera works, you can upload a library of people's faces to the camera, such as a company building, and anyone that isn't known to the actual camera or that's on your facial recognition databases, you can have that send an alert through saying that it's an unauthorized person. And that's the same also with the ANPR cameras. So with an ANPR camera, you could have that just taking captures of vehicles and their plates as they're seen by the camera, or you can link into a barrier system, access control using 𝐂𝐸𝐸 as well. Quite a wide range of things that you can actually achieve with the ANPR cameras and the facial recognition cameras. There's also a specialist range of cameras, such as the ATEX cameras, which are your explosion-proof cameras for specialist environments. And you've also got your stainless steel cameras as well for your anti-corrosion, which are available from ourselves as well. But our pre-sales team can help with specifying cameras for those kind of scenarios as well, where they are needed. And so we're always available to talk through with that to meet the requirements of the site, or if there's anything specialist that needs to be done with the cameras, and we can look into that in greater detail as well. So first things first is the fisheye cameras. So these are generally either ceiling mount, or you can wall mount them as well, but you don't benefit as much if they're wall mounted from the 360-degree view. They are generally best used as your ceiling mount. And these now use the new Imavision lenses, which I'll show you a picture of in a moment, but it gives more clarity at the furthest edges of the actual lens itself, and so you're not getting that distortion in the camera image. So these are great as overview cameras of a room. So you're not having to fit multiple cameras to give you full coverage in, for example, an office scenario or wide open space. You can use a fisheye camera mounted in the middle of the ceiling itself, and it will give you a full overview of that area that it's looking at. And as I mentioned, when you're using them in a shop or a supermarket, for example, you can use the heat mapping functionality to track your footfall in your different areas, and you can set up different zones so you can measure those using the fisheye cameras as well. So this is the Imavision lens on the left-hand side, and then we've got the actual original fisheye camera that was released some years ago on the right-hand side. So you can see on the right-hand image, as it's zoomed in, there's a distortion to the colour wheel that we've got there mounted in the corner, whereas on the new Imavision lens, that's greatly reduced from that. And you've also got a larger viewing out point as well. So the blue line is where the standard lens would end, whereas with the new Imavision lens, you actually have a greater upward kind of angle with the 360-degree lens now as well within that. We also have the AccuSense range. So these are your alarm filtering cameras. So for example, if you've got a home install or a small business install and they're wanting to use your line crossing and intrusion detection, standard line crossing and intrusion detection does create a lot of false alarms from the actual events themselves, and generally a lot of people will just want to turn those notifications off when they're getting a few hundred possibly through a day. So for these kind of installs, there's the newer AccuSense range of cameras, and what they'll do is they'll use target classification using the algorithms from Hikvision to filter out a lot of those false alarms from the system. So you can actually set them to only trigger off human and or vehicles, and it will then use the algorithm to filter out any weather, lighting, trees and bushes, animals, stuff like that from the cameras. And those work at around 80% accuracy within that. So you still do get some false alarms through, but it is greatly reduced on those AccuSense cameras, and they're perfect, especially for smaller installs where you need them to be able to have those line crossing and intrusion detection VCAs, but you don't want to have all those false alarms coming through. So it makes it a lot more usable system, and not something where your client is just going to want to turn off the notifications because they're sick of the phone going off all the time on the system. Building on from the AccuSense range, there's also your Deep in Mind NVRs, which work at a 90% accuracy rating with the false alarm filtering. So it's the same kind of idea and concept. However, your Deep in Mind NVRs do it at a greater accuracy than the AccuSense cameras within that as well. We've also got the 4K 𝐂𝐓𝐕 cameras. So a lot of people have now used the 𝐂𝐓𝐕 cameras, and it's probably one of the best selling cameras that we're seeing now. I know I've spoken to a lot of our installers and they're preferring the 𝐂𝐓𝐕 cameras, especially over standard IR images. So you're getting the full colour image no matter whether or not it's day or night time. So you can see between the two cameras, the main point with 4K is not such as when you're viewing it live, but in playback, it gives you that additional digital zoom capability. So if you digitally zoomed a 2 megapixel camera, you'll see that it starts to become pixelated very easily, even if you only zoom in a little bit digitally. Whereas the 4K 𝐂𝐓𝐕 cameras have a lot more pixels, so there's a lot more pixel density. So when you zoom in, which you can see on the left-hand image there, you still get a lot of the sharpness within the image, even though you have digitally zoomed that image in there. So you keep that clarity with the 4K cameras. I know it's something that we do get asked a lot, especially in technical, what the benefits are of using 4K. A lot of clients think that you need to use a 4K monitor in order to be able to benefit the most from a 4K camera. But that would only be when you're viewing it at full resolution. A lot of the key benefits with the 4K resolution is the digital zoom aspect of it. So even after the image is recorded, the camera's not zoomed in a specific location, you can use the digital zoom to try and get that person to the end of the driveway or further afield in the camera. You'll be able to digitally zoom and be able to achieve a much clearer picture than you would with a standard 2 megapixel camera, for example, within that. What we have now is the thermal cameras. So specifically with optical cameras, if there's lighting in the image, you can struggle to see a person, especially at a long distance. Within that, especially if there's light looking towards the camera, the image sensor can struggle with seeing beyond where that light is, especially in wide open areas as well. A thermal camera isn't affected by any lights in the area, as it is looking for heat sources. So when you're needing to be able to see a human, you can actually achieve a better result often with the thermal camera. So you can see on the right hand side, we can clearly see the person, whereas on the optical image, we can't see them at all from the camera until they actually turn the light on, and you can see them up there. You can't see that person, but the thermal camera can pick that person up. So these are great for your kind of monitored systems where you need an accurate monitoring or coverage, where there may be a person hide behind foliage where you won't be able to see between the camera. And also if there's lighting in the area that is looking towards the camera location as well, can use a thermal camera in that kind of solution. This looks more at the issues when you've got foliage in the image. So you can see on the left hand side, we can't see the person as clearly, but with on the right hand side with the thermal camera, we can clearly see that there's someone trying to hide in the foliage, and that's because they're giving off body heat, which is greater than the ambient temperature around them. So you can make it a lot better kind of detection, especially when you're using intrusion and line crossing events within that. Whereas an optical camera in that kind of scenario wouldn't be able to give you accurate results from the system, and your operators may miss the person being in that area as well. Whereas the thermal gives you that benefit of working off the heat that's generated from the human body from that. Where thermals we see generally used the most now is on your perimeter, especially on perimeter fencing lines such as solar farms and wide long distance kind of detection. So you can see on the left hand side we've got a standard line crossing on an optical camera, and we've got a person that's 250 meters away, which you can't really see at all on the optical image. If they walked through the line crossing at the top of that, at the further distance, the VCA rule wouldn't be able to trigger because there's not enough there for the actual analytics to see that something has crossed that intrusion detection line. Whereas with the thermal cameras, they can see a greater distance, especially with the heat of a human. And we see these used a lot within the perimeter protection side of things. So you can see even at 250 meters, it's still detected a person crossing the intrusion detection line. And you can see on the right hand side, the green boxes round the other two people, that's mapping them. So it's the camera's watching it to see if those people actually cross the line crossing as well. So you can achieve a lot greater distances with the thermals than you can with a standard optical lens, especially a fixed lens camera within those. And speaking of lens sizes, one of the greatest asked questions is what lens size should I use for my site, for the area that I'm looking at. Generally for wide open areas or where you need overall coverage, such as on the front of houses or in office space, for example, 2.8 millimeters is generally the lens size that's used the most in those areas. And then your 4 mils and your 6 mils are when you're needing to focus in on a specific area further away within that. But the best way to check to make sure that the lens size is correct for the system that you're looking at or the environment is to use the Hikvision lens selection tool, which we're going to take a look at in a moment, which you can see on the left hand side there. So you can put in your target detection distance, so where you need to be able to see, the mounting height of the camera that you're going to be installing, how high you can mount it, and then you can select from a wide variety of different cameras and different lens sizes, and it will actually give you an example of the pixel density that you would achieve at the distance that you've set on the camera within that, and it'll give you your angles as well at different distances away from the camera, because depending on the mounting height you will have a blind spot close to the camera and you may not get your actual optical image till much further away from where the camera's mounted. So the lens selection tool is great for being able to pick your lens sizes. And what we also get asked for is being able to show to our installers clients the detection or the coverage areas that you can achieve with different cameras. And this is where we use a tool called 𝐂𝐨𝐫𝐸, especially when we're helping out our customers with project designs with their systems. This allows you to import maps, Google Maps as well, and even floor plans, and you can put in, you set the scale of the actual plan that you've uploaded to the software, and you can drop in your different cameras, and you can see it will give you your different detection areas, whether or not it's recognition, detection, or overview image from the cameras. And you can set in your different heights and the lens sizes, and that will affect the overall coverage of the cameras, and that will give you a visual representation which you can then take to your clients after you've done the design and submit that as what the system will be able to achieve on paper within a report within that. So it's a great tool that we use quite a lot as well, especially when we're helping out customers to be able to work out which lens size fits right for their site that they're looking at within that as well on there. So Hikvision have a wide variety of online tools that are available now, which I'll bring up on here in 2 seconds. So originally with the tools that are available from 𝐂𝐂𝐕, you used to have to download and install each software that you want to be able to use. But there's now an online version of the 𝐂𝐂𝐕 tools. We've done a video on which is uploaded to our YouTube channel covering each of these in more in depth. So we've got the lens selection tool, which you'd use for selecting the different lens sizes that you'd need for your site. There's also the thermal design tool. So this allows you to select the right thermal cameras for the detection distances that you're needing for a site. So this is great for putting plans together for a perimeter protection solution using the thermal cameras. And if we go into this on the system, you can see that we can upload an image of a map that we can use for the system. But what we can also do is choose between whether or not we're going to be looking at using the VCA side of things, so the line crossing intrusion detection on the thermal cameras, or whether or not we want to show the temperature measurement. So temperature measurement would be when you're wanting to be able to look at an object and seeing when the temperature exceeds a specific temperature or drops below the temperature that's been set on the system. And we've also got fire detection as well. Now, depending what mode you're using the camera in can affect the working distances on the different analytics within the thermal cameras as well. So when using this tool, you do need to make sure that you set the working mode that you're going to be using for your scenario, whether or not the VCA, fire detection, or the temperature measurement side of it on there. And if I go back, we've also got the storage and network calculator. So this is great for working out the number of hard drives and the size of the hard drives that you need to use for the cameras that you're going to be installing on the system. And you can name these as well and export a list of them. So if, for example, we're looking at 10 of the 8 megapixel cameras, and you can see it already enters in our recommended bitrate depending on our camera resolution, the encoding that we're using, and also the frame rates. So if we drop that down to 20 frames a second, it reduces the recommended bitrate that we need for each camera. But if we set that to 25 frames per second, and you can see we can either put in the amount of storage. So if we put in an 8 terabyte hard drive, we'd be able to get 9 days of recording. A lot of people generally use, especially for storage, a standard of 31 days of recorded footage on a system. So you can go in and select the Calculate Disk Space tab, and you can enter in the number of days that you need the system to be able to achieve. And the calculator will tell you how much storage space is required for the system on there as well. If you're using motion detection recording, you can reduce the amount of hours per day that the actual system's recording for within that as well. If we go back, there's also an allocation mode for using the hybrid SAN units, which is a mass storage system. And you can also use what's called pStore, which is a server-based storage system, which we run on our 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 storage servers as well. In that, there are a few other different tools that are available on this as well, which I'll email a link out to the video that I've done covering each of them, such as the intercom designer, the turnstile tool as well, and also the LED selection tool. The LED selection tool is useful for when you're building a video wall. You can put in the exact dimensions of the room that the video wall is going to be installed in, and how high and how wide you need it to be, and it will actually tell you which monitors you need, the bracketry, and it will actually give you a cable design for the video wall as well within that. So if we take a look at the IP CCTV tips, so a lot of people that have installed IP cameras in the past, especially Hikvision ones, will have came across the SADP tool at some point. So this is used to address your IP devices, such as your IP cameras, your NVRs, and your DVRs. So if I move the SADP tool over onto my PC. So this is a network discovery tool that is specifically for Hikvision devices. So it will scan all the devices on your network and be able to see all the Hikvision devices and then list them on the actual tool itself. So within this gives you the ability to activate a camera manually if it's not plugged directly into a recorder. You can also edit an IP address within this as well. So if I select one of our cameras, take on the 7732, you can see we've got the option to enable or disable DHCP at the top. So if we untick that, we can then have the option to change the actual IP address of that recorder. Now, you don't want to just give the device any IP address, as it may already be in use on the actual system, it's on the actual network. So you need to ensure that there isn't a network conflict when you change this. And the easiest way to do this is to ping the IP address that you want to set on the system. So what we can do is, if we bring up command prompt on our laptop, and then we can use the command ping and then type in the IP address that we want to give to this one. So for example, we search for 200.169 and then hit enter. This will then start pinging that IP address, and you can see that we have had a reply from that IP address. So that means that that's already in use on the actual network itself. So we can try another one. So we just pinged 192.168.200.168, and you can see that we've got a destination host unreachable, which means that there's nothing currently on this IP address. So what I can do is I can change this to use the 200.16 IP address, 16H, let's say, and then at the bottom we would then input the admin password for the camera itself, and then click on modify, and you can see that's now changed that IP address on that recorder to that. So it's always important to check and ping an IP address before you assign it to a device to make sure it's actually freely available on the network, in order to prevent on the actual system itself. On managed networks, generally the IT for the site would give you an IP range which you can assign to the cameras. So you can actually select multiple cameras within SADP, and then you can batch assign IP addresses. So your start IP address would be the first IP address that the system would assign. So for example, if we were using 192.168.200.200, so the first IP address would be assigned 200.200. The next IP address, or should I say the next camera, would then be addressed as 192.168.200.201. So each next camera would be assigned the next number up on the last octet of the IP address within that as well. We also often get asked how to check the IP range of the network, especially for installers that are installing within the home. They need to be able to check what IP address range is being used. So to do this, you can use the command ipconfig, hit enter, and if you're using a wired connection, it would be your Ethernet adapter, and it would then give you the IP address that your laptop or your PC has been given via DHCP on the network. So you can see mine's 200.231, and it will also give you the default gateway as well, which is generally the router's IP address. Now I say generally, often on managed networks, the gateway address might not be the actual router's address, dependent on the network that's on site. And in those kind of scenarios, it is best to speak with the IT teams on site, even if they're remote IT, to check what IP addresses need to be entered on the system in order for it to work on there, as there are generally restrictions on managed networks and which can block and prevent the CCTV system from working correctly as well on there. Now, what the SADP tool is also used for is password resets. I know myself, I've forgot passwords a lot of times when I've been using them within a system. It did used to be where it was a security code you used to use. The new password reset system is a lot more secure. So now what you do is you would select the camera or the recorder on SADP, and then in the bottom right hand corner there's an option for forgot password. If we click on that, it'll then give us a couple of different options. So we've got an option to export a file or generate a QR code. The best way to do this, and the one that we recommend, is to use the file export. So if we click on export at the top, and then if I select my desktop, I'm just going to put this in my password resets folder, and then we click on select folder, and that will then export the file to the folder that we've selected. So if we then bring up our system, and if I go into my password reset folder, you can see at the top there we've got the DS-2CD2347G2 camera. So this is the file that we have just exported from the camera. In order to get that reset, that would then need emailing the file itself. If it's been purchased, if the device has been purchased from ourselves, you can send that file over to technical@dynamic-cctv.com, and our colleagues would then be able to generate a reset file through the system. If the device hasn't been purchased through ourselves, you need to email support.uk@𝐂𝐸𝐕.com, and 𝐂𝐸𝐕 will be able to provide a password reset file for the device. Once that file has been sent back to you via email, you then go to forgot password again, click on import file, and then you would select the file on your PC that has been sent back to you and enter in your new password. Click confirm at the bottom, and that would set the password to the new one that you have input on the SADP tool for that. There are also cameras, especially those with an SD card slot. There's a little flap on turret cameras and bullet cameras. If you unscrew that, there's a small button under that flap, and you can actually use that to reset the camera. So you'd press and hold that button, disconnect the camera from power and reconnect it. Keep the button depressed for 30 seconds and then release, and that would reset the camera as well. So that's another way to reset it without having to use the SADP tool on there. So switch back. There's also bandwidth calculations to take into account within IP especially. So depending on the recorder that you're using, there is a limitation on the amount of incoming bandwidth that recorder can handle. So you can see on the left hand side, I've used the Hikvision disk calculator, and I've put it into bandwidth mode on the tab along the bottom. So I've put in 32 of the 8 megapixel cameras running at 25 frames a second, and that's given me a bandwidth of 256 megabits per second. And as you can see on the 7732, so it's a 32 channel I-series MVR, we do have 256 megabits per second of incoming bandwidth. Now, if we tried to put all those 32 cameras on that NVR, we would get an error saying that there is insufficient bandwidth on the system. So the actual disk calculator only gives you the bandwidth calculation for the mainstream from the cameras. I know a lot of you will be familiar that the IP cameras give out a mainstream and a substream. So your main stream's used for the recording, and then your substream's used for your live view on the system and also your remote viewing of the system as well. So with that 256 megabits per second of bandwidth, we also need to add on manually 0.5 meg per second per camera for the substream. That is approximate. On some systems, depending on the substream settings that you're using, that bandwidth might be slightly higher or lower. So for 32 cameras, we'd be looking around 16 meg per second additional, which would take us above the incoming bandwidth limitation of the actual recorder. So that's something to watch out for and to calculate before putting in a system. But using the calculator, you can go in and you can tweak your frame rates and your bit rates to see which is best and to bring you within the incoming bandwidth that the actual recorder is capable of on the system itself for that. Now, especially with IP, there's often times where you need to manually change the IP address of your laptop in order to be able to connect to a device, especially if it's on your own CCTV network. So if there isn't a router giving out a DHCP address and you need to be able to get into the web front end of the camera, especially if, for example, your camera is plugged into the PoE ports of a recorder. So in order to do this, you would right click on the network symbol in the bottom right hand corner of your laptop. It may be a Wi-Fi signal if you're connected to Wi-Fi at the time. You then click on Open Network and Internet Settings, and it will then bring up this window. So bring that full screen. We then have an option to change the adapter options. So you can see there, I've got a few different connections. So I've got my Wi-Fi and I've got the Ethernet. The Ethernet will be your physical connection on your laptop. You may have multiples of these depending on the network cards and the system that you have. So we can right click on this, go to Properties, and then we would select Internet Protocol version 4, click on Properties again, and you can see that my laptop's currently set to obtain an IP address automatically. So this will be using DHCP. But to manually set the IP address, we go to use the following IP address. And generally, if we're connecting to a camera that's plugged into PoE ports on the back of a recorder, we would generally use 192.168.254.200. And this means that the laptop wouldn't conflict with anything on the network, unless on the PoE port, should I say, unless you were using nano beams, where we do pre-configure them to 200 and 201. So in that instance, you may want to use the end octet set at 230 when connecting PoE ports on the laptop. If you click in a subnet mask, it would automatically put in your subnet mask address in there, depending on the IP address that you've input at the top. And then we'd click on OK and OK the window behind us as well to then change that. I won't do that right now, just it would drop out the webinar because I'm using my LAN connection to stream this currently for that. What we do also get asked for is the transmission distances that you can achieve when using IP systems. So for data only, so this would be between switches, for example, using Cat5, you'd be able to achieve up to 100 meters. When using PoE, this is reduced to a distance of 90 meters between your switch and the camera that's being powered by that switch. There is also now on a lot of the NVRs and also the Hikvision switches and TP-Link switches, the option to enable extend mode, and that would give you a transmission distance of up to 250 meters from the PoE switch to the camera. What this would do though is reduce the bandwidth down to 6.5 megabits per second. So if you had an 8 megapixel camera or PEZ, for example, on this, generally the bit rates are a lot higher, so you'd struggle to get those running on those longer runs, in which case you generally use fibre for really long transmission distances. We do also have a range of PoE extenders and data extenders from one of our partners, Veracity, and so these will also extend PoE as well as the data. So we've got inline units, we've got data only units, and we also have what's called a long span, which allows you to achieve really long cable runs between two long span units, a base and a camera side unit, and that will also transmit PoE down Cat5 as well. So you can actually still use Cat5 cable with those, and they're a brilliant bit of kit when they're needed within that. In some scenarios, there's need to be able to use wireless transmission. So on some sites, you may not be able to get a cable between two locations or between the camera and the NVR. So there's two different main wireless units that we use. So I know quite a few customers have used the nano beams in the past, and these are great for smaller installations when you're just generally using point-to-point links, but there is a limitation on these where you can only really use reliably up to 4 or 6 cameras per bridge link. Now this is due to the CPU within the nano beams. So if there's bad weather on site, what the wireless units are doing is they're correcting and checking the data packets to make sure that the data is correct that's being sent between the two links. As the bad weather encroaches, that's then using more the CPU within the links within that. So there is a limitation there that we've recommended of between 4 to 6 cameras per nano beam link. The systems that are needing to run a lot more cameras or needing a higher end solution, there's the new AMG wireless units which are on our website, and some of these units can go up to 150 cameras per bridge link. We also have point to multi-point solutions with these, and we can also pre-configure them before they're sent out from ourselves. And so they basically work as plug and play when you get them on the site, which saves engineers a lot of time on the configuration of the system when they're on site installing the CCTV on there. Now above that, on some scenarios you may need to use protected frequencies, or you may need to use a lot of wireless points in an area such as a town or city centre. And then we work with a company called Perdicom using Cyclu radio links and several other different manufacturers to be able to put together bespoke wireless solutions for those kinds of scenarios. And if you need us to be able to look at anything like that, please contact our project team at project@dynamic-cctv.com. And if you have any site plans or anything like that, if you could send those over, then we can help put together a design for the wireless solution on site, which is reliable and will achieve what you're needing to for the system as well. So you have that reliability within that you know it's going to work on site, and you're not going to be going backwards and forwards dealing with multiple issues with the wireless dropping out, for example. So now we're coming on to the TVI side of things. So we do get asked a lot about the transmission distances for the TVI systems. Now this varies depending on the resolution of the cameras that you're using, as well as the cabling that you're using. So generally with TVI you'd use coax cable, but I know a popular solution is to use Cat5 using balance. Can reduce the distances that you can achieve with those cameras on there. So you can see different resolutions down the left hand side, as well as the cabling and the different distance that you can achieve on those cable runs. And then again on the far right, we also have the POC transmission distances. So POC is power over coax, so you don't need to run a separate power cable or a separate PSU to be able to power your TVI cameras. If you're using a POC DVR and a POC compatible camera, you can actually power the camera from the recorder, similar to how you would IP system using PoE on that, which has been, it's now available from ourselves as well. So as I mentioned about the 𝐂𝐸𝐴𝐳 technology earlier, it is available in the TVI range now and is built into your TVI recorders. So your IDS-72 units are your 𝐂𝐸𝐴𝐳 TVI DVRs, which has the false alarm filtering within those as well. And you'll notice at the end of the model number for the 𝐂𝐸𝐴𝐳 recorders, they'll have a 4S at the end of the model number, and that means that they can have 4 channels of 𝐂𝐸𝐴𝐳 analytics enabled on the system. So it'll be 4 camera channels that can be enabled with the alarm filtering, line crossing, and or intrusion detection BCA rules on there. So the way 𝐂𝐸𝐴𝐳 works is it uses a GPU to run the analytics for the system itself. So within the 𝐂𝐸𝐴𝐳 IP cameras, the GPU is built into the IP camera. For TVI, it's similar to the Deep in Mind NVRs, where the GPU is actually in the recorder, which is running the analytics and filtering out those false alarms from the system. We also have audio solutions available for the TVI systems. So there's now the ability to have audio over coax, so you're not having to use a separate microphone and a separate audio cable wired to the back of the recorder. Both the video and audio will be able to run down the same coaxial cable as long as you're using AOC DVR and AOC cameras that support the function. The IDS 𝐂𝐸𝐴𝐳 recorders support the AOC functionality, so you can use an 𝐂𝐸𝐴𝐳 recorder and also have the ability to use the AOC functionality as well within that on those units. As I mentioned with the POC recorders, so these send power and the video down the same coaxial cable, so this makes it a lot easier for engineers to install. They're not having to worry about fitting separate power supplies, additional cabling costs for the actual power cables as well. You're just having one cable go from the recorder to the camera. The only downside to this is you don't have the AOC functionality with POC technology or the 𝐂𝐸𝐴𝐳 technology either. What Hikvision have done is they've combined the 𝐂𝐴𝐕 technology and POC into the same systems now as well. So you can use a 𝐂𝐴𝐕 camera that supports POC on a POC recorder within that as well. So it combines the 2 technologies in one system. So now I'm just going to switch over to my web browser. I'll just log back into the systems again. So we've got a TVI, DVR, Hikvision K series, and also an IP camera, which we're going to take a look at. So with TVI cameras, most of the image settings to adjust for the actual cameras themselves are in the OSD menu from the camera. Now, to save time on site, what you can actually do, as long as the recorder is accessible remotely by the web front end, if you need to go into the OSD menu of the cameras themselves, you can actually call the OSD menu through the web front end. So in the right hand corner there, the 3 lines, that's the menu button, which will bring up the OSD menu for the camera itself. And within this, you can change your day to night switch settings, your exposure levels, video settings. You can actually reduce your camera resolutions within the OSD menu itself. For PEZs, this is generally the best way for TVI PEZ to actually configure your privacy masks, and this ensures that the privacy mask is set to the region that you're looking at. It's not going to follow you around if you set it through the TVI recorder and it's applied to the PEZ. So to change the different settings on the camera, we use the PEZ controls in the top right hand corner, and these allow us to control the OSD menu for the TVI camera itself. To enter, or what you'd use as to click For instance, on the menu options, you'd use the Iris Plus button. So you can see we can go in and change the exposure mode, the AGC settings. If we change settings and then we want you to then save and exit, be the bottom option and then the Iris Plus button. I'm just going to go back on this one and we're going to go into our day-night settings within that. So within this page, we can set the day-to-night threshold and the night-to-day threshold. So dependent on the scenario, it may be that there is some lighting in the area, which is causing the camera not to switch over as early as it should to night mode on the system. So within this menu, you can actually go in and change the threshold in which this will switch on the system itself, and vice versa for the night to day threshold as well within that. This may be the case if you have a floodlight that comes on. It may affect the camera image within that, so you can go in and adjust the day-night settings on there as well. If the camera is mounted in an area where there is enough ambient light or there isn't enough light, you can actually change the mode of the camera itself, so it's not automatically switching between day and night mode. You can actually go in and change it to either stay in full color mode, or you can switch it to black and white, which would be your night mode as well within that. I'm just going to go all the way down to the bottom now and go to exit. Click on Iris Plus and then I've exited out of there as well. What you can also do with the TVI recorders is you can actually add in IP cameras to them. So for example, this unit's an 8-channel recorder. If we go into our camera management page, you can see we've got our analog connection channels, which are our TVI cameras, but we also have a tab along the top for IP camera. So we can click on this and we can go in and manually add a camera to the system. So for this, if I add in our IP camera, which we've got here, I'll copy that IP address and then paste that in there. And then we just need to enter in the password for the IP camera that we're wanting to add. Now you'll see at first it'll say that the camera's offline. In order to refresh this, we just need to go out of the camera management page, go back in, and you can see that the status is now online for the camera itself. We go back into our live view. The first 8 channels are the TVI cameras because they're already assigned, and then you can see at the bottom we have our IP camera, which is now displaying in the bottom of the screen there as well within that. We go into our video and audio settings. So within here we can still change the frame rate and the bit rate of the cameras that we're using. So you can see the A1 channels are your analog signals, so these will be your TVI cameras. The ones that start with the D are your digital cameras, so these will be your IP cameras on the system. So within here we can go in and change the bit rates that we're using, the resolution that we want to record at as well, depending on what's required for the site. And we can also go in and edit the substream settings for each of the cameras, dependent on what's needed. If you have an area where there's a lot of fast movement, you generally set the frame rates higher. If the camera is mounted somewhere where there's not a need to be able to track fast movements in the camera image, then you'd set the frame rates lower, and you'd also drop down your bit rates usually as well. If there isn't a lot of motion on screen and it's not in a high traffic area, but the frame rates and bit rates set quite high, it's just wasting up the storage capabilities of the machine itself. So it's best to reduce those to make sure that they're the right fit for the actual site, and they'll be the best scenario, and you'd be able to achieve the most amount of storage you can while still retaining a good enough image for where the system is mounted on there. If we go into our event section and go into Smart Event and go into our intrusion detection, you can see this has got a couple of different options that are available as opposed to a standard TVI DVR. So we've got our target detection, which is our target classification. This is an 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 TVI recorder. So they're really easy to set up. All we do is enable the intrusion detection. We draw the area that we want to be able to trigger when a person or a vehicle enters the zone. So if we take human and or vehicle, and the threshold is the time in seconds that the vehicle or person needs to be in the area, or if Spider-Man breaks into the site, you to be able to have that trigger come through. So if we set the threshold to 2 seconds on here, we then also have an option for the minimum and maximum size. So this gives a greater filter on the triggers that are coming through from the camera. So your minimum size is the minimum size a person or vehicle is going to appear on screen. So the best way to set this is to have a vehicle or a person at the furthest distance away from the camera in the detection zone, and you would draw the minimum size slightly smaller than that person or vehicle. And the maximum size would be the maximum someone or a vehicle would display on the camera image. And setting these correctly helps to give you the best alarm filtering that you can achieve with the system on site as well on there. So if we move to our NVR, go into our system. So this is one of the K series NVRs. Now, generally with these units, these have, you can see this one's an 8 channel, and it also has 8P at the end of it, which means it's got 8 PoE ports on the back of the recorder where you can directly connect cameras. So what you can do with this, instead of having to have the cameras on the main network, it's completely segregated onto the NVR itself. But for example, if you still needed to access the web front end of those cameras, because it's on a separate IP range, you can't access them without directly connected into the back of the unit. But what you can actually do is, if you go into Network, go into Advanced Settings, and then click on the Other tab, there's then an option called Enable Virtual Host. If we tick that and click Save, see Save Succeeded in the bottom. If we then go back into System, go into Camera Management, and then click on IP camera, we've then got blue hyperlinks next to each of the cameras. So you can see that camera isn't on the main network, it's plugged into the PoE port, so it's got a 254 address. Usually I wouldn't be able to access that camera unless I connected into the PoE ports on the back of the recorder, but with the virtual host, I can click on the blue hyperlink there, and you can see it's connecting on port 65,002, and this will allow me to log into the web front end of the camera itself, even though it's plugged into the PoE port on the back of the recorder. So this allows me to get into the back end configuration of that camera. What you can also do if you're looking after your sites remotely is you can port forward the 65,000, and it will be 65,001 for your first PoE port, all the way up to 65,016 for your 16th PoE port. If you forward those IP addresses ports to the IP address of the recorder, you would be able to access the web front end of those cameras remotely with the external IP address of the site itself on there. So there are different benefits between using IP over TVI, but it all depends on the scenario and the site you're looking at within those, and I've covered that in a bit more depth and in detail on our IP overview webinar, which you can see the recorded version on our Dynamic YouTube channel there as well. So the main tools really for installs, especially for IP installations, is a network cable tester, especially if you're making your own patch leads. I know I've done it a few times where I've got the cores mixed up on the Cat5 crimps. Network cable testers, very easy to use, and will let you know if you've got any of the cords the wrong way around. The most important one of all is to have a laptop with you, even for TVI systems. This allows you to access the web front end of NVRs, DVRs and cameras, and also download firmwares that are needed for the systems. But also, if you're having a major issue on site and we're not able to resolve the issue over the phone, this allows us to be able to use TeamViewer to be able to get onto the system remotely and to help resolve the issue with yourselves as well within that. And also always carry spare Cat5 patch cables. These are great for testing if you need to take a camera off an existing cable run and just test it locally on the recorder. You can use one of the patch cables instead of having to rerun a cable for quick and easy testing on there. And I just want to mention our technical support team. So we do have 10 technical support members of staff that are there to help after when an engineer is on site installing a system. If they're having any issues, if something's not working quite right, they're more than happy to assist with those on there as well. So thank you for joining me today. I know the webinar has ran on longer than I was originally planning for this, and we have covered quite a lot in this webinar. And I know there has been a few bits coming through on the Q&As as I've been going along. If you have any questions, if you send an email to our pre-sales inbox, and myself and the rest of the team will be able to help with any of those questions on there that you send through for those. But thank you for joining me today. When the webinar closes, it will redirect you to a feedback page. I'd be grateful for any feedback that you can give us, and that would help us to improve our webinars for yourselves and the rest of our customers going forward. And if you have any suggestions for other webinars to do in the future, if you could let us know on that feedback form, that would be really appreciated. But thank you and take care and stay safe, and I'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you.